People ask me all the time, are you worried that AI is going to take your job? And I tell them no, but I'm worried that you would ask me that question because it tells me a lot about what you think my job is. If all we're doing is teaching vocabulary and grammar, then AI is going to replace us and we might as well change careers. The reason that I didn't understand why I was not being an effective teacher the first time I did it was because I was like, I don't understand why I can do it and I can explain the rule to you, then you can understand the rule, but you can't do it. What's the breakdown here? I sat in on a Spanish 101 class, very task-based, very clear non-linguistic outcome. Students could not do the pedagogic task at the beginning of the lesson. 50 minutes later could do it. And the student really frustratedly says to the other one, when is she going to start teaching us stuff? We don't learn anything in this class. What is on non-experts' minds is a linguistic syllabus, right? Because what else do they have to anchor their learning on? If high-level accuracy was your benchmark for your professional efficacy, then you're going to feel like a failure because students' language is going to get really messy really quickly. And instead of looking at that as fun, exciting, emergent evidence of interlanguage development, you look at it as, I'm not doing my job. I'm bad at my job. And especially if students are socialized to expect high accuracy and controlled performance, then they're going to think you're bad at your job too.
This is the Teacher Talking Time Podcast.
Matt Coss asks a very important question that many language programs need to face. How do we know if what we're doing is actually working? Matt is an assistant professor of applied linguistics and language assessment coordinator at the University of Alabama. His work focuses on the relationship between language learning research and classroom practice, especially task-based teaching and assessment, program design, teacher education, and why learners continue or stop studying languages. Prior to moving to academia, Matt spent 13 years teaching Mandarin and Spanish across different age groups and proficiency levels, which basically gives his research a very strong connection to classroom reality. He's also the co-lead of the Collective Wisdom in The Language Educator. He's also interviews editor for Task, and he's a founding co-editor of the Focus on Practice section of Language Awareness. So folks, this episode goes beyond task-based language teaching. It's also about assessment, about retention, about sustainability, and it's also about whether our language programs are truly producing the outcomes we say we value. We hope you enjoy the show. And this episode of the podcast is brought to you by Fluentize. Fluentize offers amazing lessons with videos, interactive lesson plans that engage teenage and adult learners so you can focus on the teaching and not worry so much about the planning. So head over to Fluentize and download some of their free materials. And of course, the link to the promotional code is here in the bio in the show notes. I hope you enjoy this episode. So, Matt, you describe yourself as a lifelong learner, a language nerd, a proud foodie, world traveler. I also know that you are a teacher researcher, a professor of applied linguistics, and an award-winning language teacher and educator. But before we even touch on any of those things, can you take me back to where everything started? What do we need to know about you and your earliest years in order to understand the journey you went on and the person you came to be?
Yeah, that's a fun question. So I always tell people that I grew up bilingual by accident. My parents are not multilingual people, and they really had no intention in my childhood of that multilingualism was a part of my upbringing. It truly was an accident. What we had in the earliest schools that I went to, like before kindergarten, daycare type schools, we had Spanish as sort of part of the curriculum, and that was by happenstance. And then the person who happened to be the Spanish teacher was a very close family friend. Her daughter is a year older than I am, so we grew up as playmates. And so this person who I grew up my entire childhood also calling an aunt, like referring to as an aunt. She spent a lot of time in a sort of childcare role for my brother and me when we were kids. And she's from Lima. So she spoke Spanish to us and her kids. She had an older daughter who also was a caretaker for us. So we grew up speaking Spanish with this pseudo extended family. And my parents only speak English. I spoke English at home. And never thought that was weird until I went to school starting in kindergarten. I grew up in a very multilingual, I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I went to urban public schools my entire life. So there were multilingual people around me. I grew up, my earliest memories of friends were some people spoke English, some people only spoke Spanish, and some people I remember speaking both with in kindergarten, first grade. And there's like longer version of details of this story, but the long and short of it is this family friend actually relocated to Shanghai when I was 8. And my parents felt like, when would we ever have a reason or a chance to go to China except to visit these people that have been such a meaningful part of my brother and my upbringing? So when I was 9, we spent a couple of weeks in China, and me just being, I think I've always been curious about multilingualism. And by that time, I had spent all of the years that I can remember in my life operating as a multilingual, right? Never experiencing the barrier of never knowing any different than speaking more than one language. And so getting to China, they had what's the word in English? Like a domestic worker who like helped out around the house. And that person spoke Shanghainese, which I was 9. I didn't know anything about varieties of Chinese, right? So I asked her to teach me some Chinese. So she taught me a bunch of Shanghainese, which I still can like do a couple very simple things in Shanghainese. And I was really excited about it, right? You're a kid who, like, I don't look phenotypically East Asian, right? So I got really positive feedback all the time, like every day that I would go outside and say anything to people. And I look back on it and wonder if she was really strategic, because one of the first things she taught me how to say was, how much does this thing cost? But I still don't know any numbers in Shanghainese. So I would do it. We would be places in a market or something, and she'd be like, go. And I would ask people, how much is this? And they would answer, and I would have no idea what they said, but I would tell them, oh, that's too expensive. So looking back, I'm like, I wonder if there was some strategy there that I didn't see as a 9-year-old. But I got a ton of positive feedback, right? People would react in ways that I didn't comprehend linguistically, but like emotionally, affectively, people were smiling and excited. But then I left Shanghai and we went around to a couple other cities in China, and suddenly I was like, why do Chinese people not understand Chinese? This is really, my parents are like, you don't speak Chinese. I'm like, I really do. Like I really could do this a week ago. So I told Mom, I was 9. I was like, I want to learn real Chinese. I don't know what I learned from that lady, but it doesn't seem like Chinese people really understand it. It took a couple of years. They found me like a private tutor. So starting at like age 13, I had a Chinese teacher once a week. But she was also a really interesting case of, I feel like I've had all of these language experiences that later when I encountered SLA helped me make a ton of sense of my entire life, which was pretty cool. But this teacher basically she didn't train to be a teacher of additional language learners. She trained to be a language arts teacher in China. She also had a 2-year-old at the time when I was taking these like one-on-one private tutoring lessons with her once a week. So I don't think she did it for like theoretically grounded reasons, but looking back on it, knowing what I know now, I see all of these choices that she made, or maybe even choices, they weren't even choices, but methods that she used, right? She never had an expectation that I was going to develop the ability to speak as in parallel with my ability to comprehend things, right?
Right.
She never expected my literacy to develop at equal pace with my oracy. And I look back on that and I wonder, was she thinking about her 2-year-old? Was she thinking about the 5-year-old she would have taught in a language arts context? And we just did a lot of stuff. She read a ton of stories to me. We like cooked food in her kitchen. So I was an atypical language learner in a couple of ways. And when I encountered instructed language learning, I always caused people problems. They were like, what do we do with you? Because you're not really a heritage speaker in a family definition, but your language is weird in that, like, you don't have a ton of explicit knowledge, which of course I didn't know any of those terms back then. Your literacy is kind of all over the place. It's like, where do you fit in language programs? And then years later, when I discovered SLA and started making sense of my childhood, I was like, oh, you can study this. Like there's ways to make sense of this. This is a thing.
It's very interesting what you just shared, because the moment you mention how second language acquisition helped you, give you a bit of a window into your own experience, I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us more about what aspects of second language acquisition helped you understand yourself better.
Sure. Yeah. When I got to college, I had come out of high school, and we should come back to my first time teaching Spanish in high school. It was that really, I think, catalyzed the journey for me. But when I got to college, I had the choice majoring in Spanish to either do a literature degree or a degree in linguistics. And I had just come off of doing AP Spanish literature as an independent study, which means I had to read 52 works of literature by myself and take a test at the end of the year. And that was it. And so I was like, I'm not doing that anymore. Like, I'm done with that. Thank you. I don't know what linguistics is, but sounds like language, so I'm going to do that. And I had a brilliant professor at UNC Chapel Hill, Bruno Cigarribia, who studies code switching and language contact. He does structural linguistics. He's not an applied linguist. But one of the classes I took with him my second year of school was a master's seminar called First and Second Language Acquisition of Spanish. And it's funny that you guys had Silvina Montrul on the show not long ago, because we read a bunch of her work, and it was reading work like hers, thinking about things. I remember really clearly, for example, one of the things that we learned was like when we learned about U-shaped development, for example, right? And you hear people talk about being no sabo kids, right? Which is U-shaped development, but is also an identity thing. And I remember like just these very specific examples, both from my own experience with either me or my younger brother, or comparing myself to the second language learners of Spanish in the room who still struggled with some of these linguistic features of Spanish, and going, oh, there's reasons for this. It's not that you're dumb. It's not that you do understand the rule and yet you still can't do it, but there's a reason for that. These things make sense. And the reason that I didn't understand why I was not being an effective teacher the first time I did it was because I was like, I don't understand why I can do it and I can explain the rule to you, then you can understand the rule, but you can't do it. What's the breakdown here? And then you start understanding how language emerges in childhood, and you go, oh, because that's not how I learned it. I just didn't know that at the time.
It's very interesting because I find that a lot of us who eventually get into language education, language teaching, the moment you start reading more about second language acquisition and you learn more about those theories, you start mapping it out. The reason why I asked you that question is because I learned English as a second language, and I didn't realize how important the importance of input, the importance of interaction, negotiation of meaning, and all of that. So like you going through that story behind your acquisition of Spanish, and later I know you also speak Chinese and you teach Chinese, and we're going to get into that as well. I think it's very interesting for a lot of teachers who still seem to neglect or still seem not to give second language acquisition the importance it deserves, especially with the way things are, the way we teach languages. And I feel like for some reason, we're still not really focusing on the findings from second language acquisition and how those findings can inform the way we teach languages, which is what makes your work very interesting to me, because you're not just in academia, you're also a research practitioner in an entire university task-based program. You've done a lot of assessment work. And right now, and Andrew knows this because I feel like it's the same thing as happening in the United States, it's happening in Canada, it's happening in Europe. A lot of language programs are under a lot of pressure.
Yep.
There are a lot of issues with enrollment, budgets. Students are dropping after level 1. Yep. AI is a big game changer now, reshaping the perceptions of language learning even is. So the question I have for you now is, can the language programs that exist today justify their own existence?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I come back often to, it's funny you mention AI because that's a question I get all the time now. And I tell people this story frequently. People ask me all the time, are you worried that AI is going to take your job? And I tell them no, but I'm worried that you would ask me that question because it tells me a lot about what you think my job is, right? It tells me a lot about like your sort of tacit theory of language teaching and learning, what you imagine when you imagine a language class or program, what you expect in terms of outcomes, what you think I assess people on that you think that all of that is replaceable by a chatbot that is neither artificial nor intelligent, actually. Because it makes me immediately want to ask you a bunch of questions that are like, what was your experience with language learning? What expectations did you have of yourself that were or were not met? And were they realistic? Were your expectations as a student, as a learner, grounded in what's realistic based on what we know about SLA, in the time constraint that you had? And I more and more have come to believe that we as language programs and people who believe in the importance of language learning have been talking to ourselves for too long. And we all know, we believe that language learning is this transformative experience, that it gives you so much more than an additional repertoire of communicative tools. But most people don't know that. And if we're the only people who know it, we also have a conflict of interest when we want to keep you in our classes, or a perceived one, where like, it's easy for someone to say, of course you think language learning is important, because if people don't take language, you don't have a job. And I always tell people, and I stole this from Chantel Warner at the University of Arizona, no, it's the opposite. I do this job because I think it's so important. It's not that I think you should do it so I can have a job. The order is inversed. But I continue to think that a part of our mission is to be able to articulate clearly to students, and not just articulate it in a one-directional way, to co-construct, examine, re-examine, visit, revisit what the value of language learning is, what you're getting out of even the first and only language class you might ever take, right? That sort of high-level, advanced level proficiency is a great goal, but it's not the only goal. Getting a job is a thing you can do with language. It's not the only reason you could or should do it. And if we can't articulate it clearly ourselves, then we already lost. But even if we can, if we're the only ones that know it, it doesn't matter. And I'm recently really thinking a lot about, there's a fantastic Cambridge element that was published at the end of 2024 by Ursula Landers at the University of York, where she's talking about the need to reconceptualize how we define the rationale for the study of languages other than English in a world dominated by English, right? And so one of the tricky things about the work that I do is I don't work with English, right? English is not the focus of any of the work that I do. And English and languages that are not English share a lot in terms of language acquisition, but also are very different in terms of contextual realities. So people who work in English in context, whether that's the United States, Canada, or outside of an Anglophone sort of society, combat this in different ways. But I think we have so much to offer in terms of what you get out of any engagement with language multilingualism, no matter what the sort of proficiency outcome is. But I don't know that we make that clear to ourselves. I don't know that we document it clearly. I don't know that students leave with that sense, because the story that we get told so often is, as soon as I tell people what I do for a living, they go, oh, I took 2 years of Spanish in high school, but I don't remember anything. And what I tell them, like what I tell people when I tell that story is, one, you're telling me that you regret it, right? That you have nothing to show for your experience. You're probably imagining that if you were confronted with the need to use Spanish to do something, you could do it. And like, you don't look back positively on that experience. And you're also like the parent of a child now. You're also an employee or an employer who values or doesn't value multilingualism, and you look at language teaching and learning through the lens of your bad experience. And so like, we're fighting an uphill battle.
Interesting.
So much. It's just that we have to actually offer it, because if all we're doing is teaching vocabulary and grammar, then AI is going to replace us and we might as well change careers. But if that's not all we do, then what do we do? And do we articulate that to the people who make the decisions, who are not us?
I got a quick question for teachers watching this. How much time did you spend planning your lessons this week? If you said more than 10 minutes, then you gotta see this. This is Fluentize, a library of more than 650 lessons for teenagers and adult learners. Let's say I want a lesson on social issues. I jump into the lesson navigation, find the video, and boom, I have a complete lesson with authentic video ready to go. And the best part is that it covers everything: vocabulary focus, listening activities, deep communicative activities that also get your students actually talking. But here's what I love most. It comes with a Google Slide e-lesson ready to share with your class. So what are you waiting for? Head over to fluentize.com, create an account, and see the quality for yourself.
It's really interesting about non-English languages, the purpose of learning it. One of my favorite texts to use in class, and I'm sure it's a very famous TED Talk, I'm sure we've all seen it, is one by John McWhorter, who was, at the time, he may still be, a professor at Columbia. And it's called 4 Reasons to Learn a New Language. And his whole thesis is learning a language that isn't English. And he goes through 4 reasons. Off the top of my head, imbibing yourself into a culture was one of them. He presents research that it lowers instances of dementia, increases multitasking ability. And at the time, I believe it was around 2010, 2011, one of them is ease of access, which it's kind of funny now to look back and look at the images that he presented because it's obsolete technology now.
Sure.
And he mentions Rosetta Stone by name in the talk, which at the time, you know. But I think it's such an important point that there are fine, quantifiable outcomes that you can get from learning a language, get a job, whatever. But there are so many other reasons that anyone should be interested in doing it. And that language, a task I give my students a lot is, you work for a marketing department, pitch us on learning a language, but it can't be English. And they struggle a lot with it because they say, why would we do that?
And the thing is that students, language learners, especially long-term ones, they believe it's a transformative experience. It's not that, at least those of us who are doing it, it's not that we doubt it, but we don't reflect on it consciously enough. John Dewey's famous quote is, we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And my colleague, Fred Poole, who I think is going to be here with y'all at some point soon, who's one of my best friends, we do a lot of work together. We did a study in a domestic immersion program, which is a very unique type of context for lots of reasons here in the US. And these people go for a summer to the middle of nowhere. They have a language pledge, so they don't really use any English. It's a very intense and very unique life experience. We documented their language proficiency development, which was very stable and robust. But we also asked all of them 2 deceptively simple questions as we interviewed them at the end of this program. One is, do you think of yourself as bilingual, multilingual, monolingual? People who have just told us that they can do anything they want to do in this language that they're learning still tell us, nope, I'm definitely not bilingual, which is interesting. And then the other one that we asked everyone at the end of this interview was, so we spent 90% of this interview talking about your language development and challenges and where you're going next and your interpretations of proficiency test scores. But besides language learning, did you learn anything else in this intense 7 or 8 weeks of your life? Did you change in any other ways? 100% of the people said yes. One person could give us an example.
Really?
And in every single person, they visibly, right? We're on Zoom, so visibly they're struggling to come up with a response. They know there's something there, but they can't say it. And if these are the stakeholders of this program, when they leave and someone else asks them, hey, was that worth the money? Was it worth the time? They go, absolutely. I learned so much. I'm so different because of it. And they're like, oh, really? How? I don't know.
And it goes back to that point you mentioned earlier, right? Like, how can we make this clear? I feel like it's what you're saying. Like, we're just not very good at articulating this well enough, which brings me to the question, how can we, because now I'm thinking, Andrew and I, we're in the college industry right now. We're just working with mostly college students. A lot of them, this is their 2nd career, 3rd career that they want to upskill. A lot of them speak 2, 3, 4 languages. They're still taking a few English classes here and there. But how can teachers help language learners better articulate this transformative nature of language learning?
I'm really glad. Yeah, I'm super glad you asked. I'm happy to share a couple of resources. We'll make a list at some point. But actually, one of the first times I ever thought about this was from a blog post from a Japanese teacher in Canada, Colleen Lee. I will never forget. I think this was 2017 when she wrote. She made it this beautiful simple infographic that's besides Japanese, what you're learning in my high school Japanese classes. I immediately stole it and have put it on every syllabus that I've ever had since then. And she talks about managing group work in diverse groups. She talks about reflection and goal setting. She talks about, there's one other thing. So we're learning Japanese for sure. That's what we're here to do. But when other people ask you about your learning, what skills you're taking away from this, whether you take any Japanese away or not, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, here are some things that we do. And what that actually catalyzed for a colleague and I, a very close friend and collaborator, Carlos Anaglia, who's at Florida State now, we did our PhDs together. We worked with a French program in Michigan with a brilliant French language program director, Anne Violon-Wygent. And we tried to do that. It was a research practice partnership where we said, and I showed her this document from Colleen and said, hey, if we all care about this, we're thinking about retention, we're thinking about recruitment. What do you think as the program director? What are the things that people should get or could get out of rudimentary French, right? Out of French that is not going to result in employable proficiency. But what else do they get? She, again, made a really beautiful document, and then she plastered it up on all the walls in our building. And Carlo and I were both like, can we wait a second before we tell everyone that this is definitely what they're getting? Because this also will shoot us in the foot if we're wrong about it, right? This is an empirical question. And so unless we're sure that this is actually what students are getting, then we shouldn't tell them, hey, you're getting all this other stuff. Because if they're not getting that stuff, then they're definitely leaving and we're compounding the problem rather than... And so we ended up doing this year-long project, and we can talk about the details. But basically what we did is we spent a semester documenting across this 4-course sequence of French whether or not students were getting these things: human connections, perseverance, leadership, risk-taking, problem-solving, and something else.
Active listening there as well. It's something
Absolutely.
that I feel like that's definitely the one thing I feel like my students can definitely articulate is like I've become a much better listener now.
Yep, which transfers outside of their language, their target language use for sure, and is a regularly sought after skill in like interpersonal relationships, just like it is in career settings. And the other thing that we did, what I love about the way that we thought about this, at least with Anne, was that like every program doesn't have to offer the same stuff, right? Like the values beyond language learning, in the same way that like Mike Long would always say that you need to do a needs analysis because learners are particular. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all. These are the benefits of language learning for everyone, context and background agnostic. But for me, for us, it became, can you define them? And then can we systematically raise students' awareness of these benefits such that they can articulate them and connect them to examples? And then can we model statistically whether there's a relationship between that increased awareness and their decision to continue or not? Spoiler alert, there is. So like, maybe that matters.
You like just jumped the gun there, because this is exactly what I wanted to shift gears towards, this retention, because you've mentioned, and I hear a lot of program leaders blaming it on motivation, blaming it on poor marketing, blaming on, oh, students are different, it's a different generation. But you've done a lot of work on this. You've studied a full task-based programs implementation. You've looked at the outcomes. So we know that the issue is not the student or the students. It's perhaps the way the course is designed or the architecture of it. So from your evaluation, from the work that you've done, what did you learn about how the program design affects continuation and therefore retention?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And again, I highly recommend the work by Ursula Landvers. It's actually open access, Cambridge Elements, like 100 pages. And what she really talks about, and I'm really trying these days to reconcile this idea with TBLT too, and I want to come back to that idea. But what she talks about is that we need to be better at emphasizing the non-material benefits, because at least in languages other than English, at least in these university undergraduate programs where students do a couple semesters of language and maybe are done, telling them that it's going to help them get a job is actually probably a self-defeating argument for most of them, because the more they learn, right? The Dunning-Kruger effect tells us the more you learn, the more you realize that you have to learn. People, you need advanced proficiency, and you give them 4 semesters, which is really like 40 hours over 15 weeks times 4, which is nothing actually in terms of actual time on task. So we get really robust outcomes if you think about it in terms of hours, not years, months, or days. You are setting students up for discouragement if you focus only on you can get a job, you can make money by doing this basic sort of rudimentary language learning. And so Ursula makes, I think, really compelling arguments about shifting towards non-material benefits, right? Why do we talk to people? To make connections, to get closer, to learn something, to figure out if we have anything in common. And at the society level, there are also benefits of that human societal cohesion, right? Mm-hmm. But as that translates to language programs, and I know we're going to talk, I'm sure, about task-based language teaching in a couple different iterations, but one of the things that became the most salient to me in looking at the program that I evaluated for my dissertation was, again, this issue of awareness or lack of awareness. So I'll tell you a story to make the example salient. I sat in on a Spanish 101 class probably 6 weeks in the semester. I got to observe so many brilliant teachers, and it was so hard to not just go to that program and sit there for 15 weeks because there was so much good stuff happening. And I watched this brilliant lesson that this Spanish 101 teacher did, very task-based, very clear, non-linguistic outcome, checked all of the boxes for me. Students could not do the pedagogic task at the beginning of the lesson. 50 minutes later, could do it. And I happened to be walking behind 2 students as they left the room. And this student really frustratedly says to the other one, when is she going to start teaching us stuff? We don't learn anything in this class.
Wow.
And in that moment, I'm thinking about what's my role here. This student doesn't know me. But I really wanted to intervene and be like, hey, wait a minute. And I did, because I was like, man, sure, I have an ethical responsibility or an opportunity here. And I was like, hey, can I ask you a question? I'm here observing. That's what teacher mentioned. And I just would love to pick your brain about that idea for just a second. You said, when is she going to teach us stuff? What are you thinking about? And there's no structure. We don't learn any grammar. We don't learn any vocabulary. And I was like, okay. When you got to class, what do you think was the goal of class? If I was to ask your teacher, what did she want you to learn today? What do you think it would be? And he was like, whatever. I don't remember exactly what the task was, but to be able to do this thing in Spanish. And I was like, okay. Cool. Could you do that when you got here today? And he was like, nope. And I was like, I just watched you do it, so you can do it now. And he was like, yeah, that's true. And I'm like, so did you not learn anything? And he was like, oh, I guess I did. And I was like, but that's not on your mind. And if we didn't have this conversation, the story you would have told everybody is that's not a good teacher. She doesn't teach us anything. We don't learn anything in Spanish class. And then I looked this kid up at the end of the semester, and they ended up with a novice high proficiency starting at 0, right? 37 and a half hours later. And I was like, clearly, my friend, you did learn stuff, including language. Yeah. But it wasn't on his. The story he was telling himself and exacerbating in a classmate is that we don't learn anything, which is not true. But what is on non-experts' minds is a linguistic syllabus, right? Because what else do they have to anchor their learning on unless we put an alternative in place, which we totally could. And that's the next direction that this program and I are actually going to work on, which I'm super excited about, which is socializing people into TBLT. But it's aware.
Other industries have nailed their value proposition. In language, we haven't quite. Let me know if this is an appropriate parable, if you think, but there's a new yoga studio that's opened up across from where I live. And it's become very popular. And it got me thinking about why people enroll in yoga classes. And I don't know the answer, but if I had to guess, it's probably not to be able to do these 3 to 4 different poses specifically. It's probably for social connection, mental health benefits, meeting new people, getting out of the house, especially in winter when it's cold.
Belonging to a community.
Yeah. Self-satisfaction. If you ask the people leaving, and I imagine they would be able to articulate for their circumstance what those specific things are.
Yep.
And why do they like the instructor? Lots of different ideas. Probably not because he or she demonstrates that pose the best way that I've ever seen that yoga pose done. And forgive me because I'm not a yoga person, so out of my element here.
Downward dog, yeah.
But is this an appropriate parallel for language classes where mental health benefits, etc., would also be a selling point?
Yeah, 100%. And it's funny, I think about this all the time. It's actually a study I really want to do. But I have a hunch that with college students, at least, I believe, my hypothesis is that if you were to take data from an entire freshman class of college students at my university, say at the University of Alabama, and you match them as you find them near peer on as many demographic variables as you possibly can. So you think about the kind of high school they went to, their level of preparedness for college, their socioeconomic status, their multilingualism, everything you can match them on. So you get two people whose only difference is that one of them in their first year of college took a language class and one of them and the other one didn't. I would be willing to bet there is a detectable difference in whether or not that student continued into their sophomore year of college, because the biggest predictor besides academic success of retention in college, not retention in language programs, but retention in college, is a sense of belonging. And what I tell people all the time is that is literally what we do. If you want to make a friend, go to a language class, because in Language 101, we are up in your business on day one. We ask you what your name is and where you live and who you love and what your social security number is. And nobody else does that. But we do, and that is the point. The point is to make connections to other humans, and you're definitely not doing that, no hate to STEM, but like in a biology 101 class with 300 people, that teacher will never know your name, and your language teacher absolutely will. And it feels to me like we undersell that value of community.
We do.
And friendship.
We do.
But when you talk to parents, which is a thing I'm literally going to go do on Monday, I'm talking to all of the admitted students in my university's parents, and this is what I'm going to tell them. You want your kids to make friends in college? Cool. Sign them up for a language class. Because first semester, people will know their name. They will know and be known to people. And that's not unique to TBLT. It is unique to the communicative approach, I think. I don't know that in a super structurally driven curriculum, we care as much about your name. We care that you can say my name is, but we don't care about the last part. But I think that, again, I think we know that. Like, I think if you ask any language teacher, they'll tell you, yeah, of course, like, we build community and we talk to each other. We know, we learn things about each other through the medium of this target language. But I don't know if the students would say, I don't know if a student would leave high school and go, I took 2 years of Spanish in high school and I made a ton of friends. Regardless of whether they say I learned Spanish or not, I don't think anybody tells the story that way. And I think they have some responsibility there.
So to extend my yoga example, if I was forced in high school to take yoga classes that sucked and I was terrible at it, and I probably left high school hating yoga, what effect does that have on when people get to university and college and then these language programs exist? What residual bad experience, how does that impact their retention or ideas of taking languages at the next level when it becomes optional?
I think it's the biggest barrier. Like, genuinely, I do. I think the biggest barrier is people's past experience. And I think it goes both ways. To be fair to, I was a middle and high school teacher, and that is where I learned to be a good teacher. I did not learn to be a good teacher working in a university. Like 100%, my skill set was developed in and with my K-12 colleagues. So I want to be real clear that like, do not believe in my bones I had a mentor who like told me this my second year of teaching, and I've never forgotten it. I don't believe that teachers show up to do a bad job. I just don't believe that. I believe we do the best with our circumstances, complex as those are. Now, having said that, people's past experiences affect them hugely in both directions, right? If I'm a person who perceives myself to have been super successful at language learning in a structural syllabus, so I was getting straight A's and I could answer every grammar question on every test I ever got, and the story I've told myself for 4 years is I'm really good at Spanish. And then I get to college and we have to talk to each other and we've never done that before. See ya. I'm out of here because I don't feel good at this anymore. And this is different than what I expected. So I'm getting out of here. And then, of course, the inverse is true, which we experience a ton more and more now. And because I sit in these two different languages, I get to see really interesting trends that are sometimes really similar and sometimes really different. What we're seeing more and more in Chinese these days is that K-12 teachers are adopting really communicative approaches and are abandoning this coverage model. But then the intake process in college is often very accuracy-based, very coverage. Do you know these words? Not what can you do with them? And so you get the opposite disconnect, right? Where people come and are suddenly like, am I bad at this? Or I have to go back to 101, but I have been doing this for years. So either way, I'm out of here. So past experience informs us a lot. And again, something I think often about is what expectations do people have of themselves? And have they ever unpacked them before? I don't think they have. You ask your students, are you fluent in your target language? They'll always tell you no. Ask them, are they fluent in their L1? You'll probably get a 50-50 response. And if you don't, ask them, can they do an astrophysics presentation in their L1? And they'll go, nope. And then I always go, but I thought you speak English. And then I'm like, oh, so you never make mistakes when you speak English? And they're like, no, I do. And I'm like, oh, but you want to never make mistakes when you speak Spanish. And they're like, I guess that's an unrealistic expectation. I'm like, huh?
It really is.
But we have to unpack that, right? And we can do so much with some really simple but repeated conversations where we help reset some of these expectations such that I think we can undo some of the like road blockage that comes with the story I'm telling myself is I'm good at this, or I'm bad at this, or I'm not a language person, or that languages are hard to learn, or that English is enough. That's another one we get all the time, that people speak English, so it doesn't matter. When you confront people with the fact that most of the English speakers in the world are additional language users of English, or are users of English of a variety that they have never experienced. I played Nigerian English for my college students who are all native speakers of English the other day, and they're like, what language is that? And so it's like, that's English. They're like, English from where? I'm like, Nigeria, where English is an official language. And that is that person's first language. And so we unpacked again this idea of like, you said all you need to do is speak English, but what would you have done when talking to that person? You have no strategies. You have no active listening. You have no negotiation of meaning training. So you can't even talk to another English speaker, but you could have, I think, if you had come to Chinese 101, because that's what we do there. Right. But I think it's a lot of awareness. I think we're playing an awareness, or we're not playing an awareness game that we could play at low cost to us and high impact. Because I don't think people arrive at the conclusions themselves, generally.
I would like to spend more time talking about this, specifically because I find that native speakers of any language are probably some of the worst communicators. They don't have active listening skills. They don't know how to negotiate meaning, know how to like paraphrase better, how to express things in different ways. And they're very impatient. They're very impatient if they're dealing with someone who doesn't speak English as their first language. I want to shift gears here and talk about medical Spanish.
Cool. I love that. That was part of the story that matters. That is my connection to TBLT. So I'm glad we're doing that.
Yeah, because you wrote about this medical Spanish article, and my understanding is that it's not only about engagement. There was a lot more there. There was a lot related to innovation. And what I really liked about that paper specifically, Matt, is we're dealing with real patients. We're dealing with real problems. We're dealing with real misunderstandings. We're dealing with real consequences, which is also very much in line with some of the language learners that we work with. So when you argue in the paper for a quote unquote true task-based curriculum, what does that mean?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question. So the context that matters is when I was in college, I got recruited my freshman year, and I did it for all 4 years of college to work in the UNC Chapel Hill Medical School, where they have this awesome program that's called Campus. I don't remember what the acronym is for anymore, but it's fantastic. The doctor who runs it is Marco Aleman, and he's wonderful. He's a first language speaker of Spanish. He and a couple of other people who have written some really good stuff about medical Spanish over many years designed this program where people who are already intermediate level or higher users of Spanish could come in. And what medical school students have to do is they do performance assessments, right? That is their entire bread and butter, is they work with people who are called standardized patients, which is what I was employed to do for 4 years, which is basically a role play, effectively, where the patient is given a scenario. This is your name, this is your job, these are your symptoms, this is your family medical history. And it is the medical school students' task by themselves to elicit that information from you. Those things are recorded, they're graded on a rubric, they're criterion referenced. And what this Campus program does is they do all of the things that they do in English, they do a parallel track in Spanish. So they're tested twice, basically, these students who are enrolled in this medical Spanish program. And so I got to work for 4 years as a Spanish-speaking standardized patient, which meant that what we did was I would go for 6 or 7 hours on a Friday, and I would see 3 students an hour or 2 students an hour. They would come in for 20 minutes. We would only speak Spanish. Most of them thought I only spoke Spanish. And then at the end, they would leave when they were supposed to go do their diagnosis. They actually had to submit what they think the diagnosis was. And then we would do a debrief, a post-task phase, if you will. We would talk about, did they reach the correct conclusion? What did I notice about their language choices or things you talked about, Leo, just now, the negotiation of meaning? I remember so clearly, for example, one of the jobs that I had once, because my condition was a cough, like a cough that wouldn't go away. And I was a welder, which, do you think any of these people, except native speakers of Spanish, of which there were a few, knew the word welder in Spanish? No. But what most of them chose to do is ignore the vocabulary item, not negotiate for meaning. And so they misdiagnosed me. They couldn't find the cause of the cough because they didn't realize I didn't wear a mask inside a factory with no windows where I was welding stuff. So we had that conversation about, like, when you encounter a word that you don't know, it is a life or death thing potentially. And you need to ask people. You can't ask them, what does that mean in English? Because they don't speak English. But you need to have strategies to deal with words that you don't know. And of course, I knew nothing about TBLT at this time. I'm an undergraduate student, so I'm 20, 21. But what I realized really quickly in talking to these students about the curriculum that they experienced that was medical Spanish, it was basically a vocabulary class. Which, like, years later when I learned about TBLT, technical vocabulary is actually really easy to learn. It's easy to map onto your existing domain knowledge, especially if you're a domain insider. But what I realized is, like, they couldn't do the mini tasks, right? They couldn't do the small talk. You would come in and they'd say, what brings you in today? And you say, oh, my foot is broken. And they'd go, great. It's not the right response. That's not expressing empathy with the patient. Or they didn't know how to negotiate meaning, right? So I was identifying these things. So I went to Marco one day and was like, hey, man, can I teach them a class? Can I do it on a volunteer basis? But if there are students here who are interested, they're struggling, and they like this feedback that I'm giving them, can I, like, do some not vocabulary with them? So I started doing tasks. And of course, I didn't know any of that, right? I came to TBLT after this. But when I took my first TBLT class with Mike Long, I was like, why is nobody talking about this? This is clearly the solution for language for any specific purpose, right? But I looked back at my own experience working in this medical Spanish context and was like, oh, this could be great because the tasks are so definable. And when we were talking about analysis of target discourse and stuff, I was like, they have a discourse bank of these recordings that are not real patients, so are way easier to get through IRB.
Yeah.
Why are we not doing this here? And so I talked to Mike about it, and he was like, write that paper. And then he was like, but nobody in applied linguistics needs you to tell them anything about TBLT. So, like, go write it in a medical journal. Go talk to the people who you actually are trying to talk to, which is how I found teaching and learning in medicine. Best editorial experience I've ever had as a writer. It's the first paper I ever wrote. Intense review, but the editor really stuck with it. And what I actually did at the time was a systematic review. I just didn't know enough about research to know that's what it was. So I read everything that I could find. Literally everything published, every medical Spanish curriculum in the US in a medical school, read it all and looked at how are they doing assessment, what's their curriculum, and on what basis is the curriculum. Intuition of either a practicing doctor or a native speaker of Spanish. Mostly lexical grammar tests. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. Like, in your context where it is literally life and death, you would think that in the limited time you have, you want to do the thing that is preparing people most optimally to do the thing that is their job. And so that's where that paper came from. I thought, I don't know if TBLT at the time, my feeling certainly was, I don't know if TBLT belongs everywhere, but I think it belongs here.
Most certainly, which, because you've mentioned that when you started working with that very specific group, you didn't know what tasks were, but you had a hunch, you had a feeling that they would work in that very specific context.
Yep.
So the question then becomes, how can we get more buy-in from teachers who probably have a little bit of that hunch when they're working with a group of students, but they don't know much about task-based language teaching? I think what I'm trying to ask, Matt, is I'm not saying that I'm trying to convert people, because you can't actively do that. But I think one way in which we can encourage teachers to experiment with tasks is by providing them with some sort of education, writing about it, talking about it, having a place like this podcast where we try to, in a way, and I think Andrew and I have veered more in the TBL gang here. We're talking more about task-based language teacher practitioners and researchers, but because we truly believe that's what makes language education more serious. Because again, we're dealing with real people that will encounter real misunderstandings in real life, and these things will have real consequences for them. So
Yep.
how can we get teachers to make the switch to start buying into task-based language teaching, even though they don't know much about it?
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question in some ways. And I think my position on TBLT, I take after Chris Van Brandon in this way, in that, like, in his book, which is a brilliant piece of work, To Task or Not to Task, I definitely feel the same way he feels, that I don't feel dogmatically committed to TBLT. It's just the thing that I've found so far that makes the most sense to me. It's the most compelling to my brain. And to build on what I know Caitlin said when she was here on the podcast, like, it made sense to me as a human, right? In my emotional desire for knowing, especially in the context of medical Spanish, that, like, I was never going to be a medical practitioner. And there are people in my life who would suffer under not being able to speak Spanish to get healthcare. I felt very compelled to do the very best thing that I could possibly do in the limited time that I and the students had to ensure that my aunt would get the best possible healthcare she could if she couldn't go to a hospital and speak English. So it sat well with my rational brain and my emotional investment in education as a place of transformation. But I think in terms of buy-in, for me, what it really starts with is coming back to fundamental values. And what I think we overlook when we dichotomize people who teach grammar — everybody teaches grammar, I wish we would stop talking about it like that — but people who structure their language teaching in a linear, form-based way versus people who structure it in a communicative event, a function, a task, whatever way, and expect nonlinearity. I wish what we would come back to is the fundamental value that I think it always boils down to, and this is true every time I do teacher education work, professional development, is that people want what's best for their students. So teachers who teach grammar per se, I'll use an example that relates to medical Spanish, people who teach commands in Spanish try to teach it systematically. And they go, I have limited time and I want you to learn as much as possible. So I'm going to explain to you the singular you in an informal way, singular you that's formal. I'm going to tell you how to do commands for more than one person. I'm going to tell you how to do the let's go do this thing commands to a group that you're including yourself in. And it is an attempt to be thorough. I'm trying to give you as much as I can possibly give you in the limited time that we have. And that's not a bad thing. Like, that desire to be thorough is not a bad thing. What I often come back to, though, in having those conversations, I go, I think we share the same fundamental value. And I think we share another value, which is we don't want students to quit. We want students to have realistic expectations of themselves. And we also want them to do stuff that feels relevant to their life, right? Like, respectfully, who is a 14-year-old telling what to do in their native language, much less in a second language? Nobody. No child is going to have any opportunity in any proximal time zone to go, you need, go away, leave me alone, stand up. Kids don't do that in their first language, so they're not doing it in a second language where they have a limited repertoire. In the same way that, like, well-intentioned role play in a high school is you be the doctor, you be the patient. I'm sorry, 14-year-olds are not doctors. They are not qualified to do that job. And at a novice high level of language, they're certainly never going to be hired to do it. So is that relevant for them in the future? Maybe. But if we focus all of our work and our teaching of language on the there and then, we lose the here and now. We tell you one day you might need to book a hotel room. One day you might need to use the past subjunctive in this very particular construction. That's not true. You're not wrong that it is possible that is one day a need. But if we lose sight of the here and now, of what can you do and what would be exciting for you to do, and what is a realistic expectation for you in the next 45 minutes, I think we lose people in the here and now and they never get to the there and then.
Yeah.
So then what are we doing? And I tend to find that line of reasoning compelling. And then the next barrier becomes, what are you willing to tolerate as a teacher? Do you look at messy, intermediate, emergent language as a reflection that you're a bad teacher? Or do you look at it as a problem that you need to fix? Or do you look at it as an opportunity for the next direction to go in? Because once I made that shift, it was really easy for me to go, I'm so glad I tell my students all the time, I'm so glad you're making errors because you're showing me that I still have value here. If you weren't making any of these errors, see ya, you're not going to be in my class. So make an error and let me follow that and go, oh, that's what you want to say? Cool. Let's learn how to say that then. Yesterday, one of my students wanted to tell his friend, we're talking about health stuff actually in my intermediate Chinese class right now. And he wanted to be able to joke with his friend and be like, man up, you're telling me, oh, my head hurts. And he wanted to tell his friend instead of, I'm so sorry you feel that way. He's, how do I say, deal with it. Don't get weak or whatever. And I was like, cool, you want to learn how to say that? Sweet. Don't say it to me and that's rude. But if that's interesting to you, let's do it. Why not?
But I think that's the whole point, right, Matt? Is we want to help people to say what they want to say within a very specific communicative context, because that's the, I'm trying to remember the name of the book. There was a really good, it's called At the Point of Need. And that was a book written by a college professor in the United States. And I think it's one of the, she doesn't talk about task-based language teaching, but I found a copy of it. But she talks about helping people to communicate at the point of need. And I think that's usually the link that I make to task-based language teaching, which is they're really trying to communicate or trying to convey a certain message at very specific moments within the discourse. And they just don't know how to say that. Like you said, like my student's trying to say, deal with it, be a man, like man up, that kind of thing. And they don't know how to say that. And for a lot of teachers, depending, of course, on their mindset, because I also feel like there is a bit of a mindset here when teaching grammar versus those who center their teaching on tasks and communicative functions, whatever you want to call it. But the mindset is my students cannot say this, good. Now I have something to give to them because this is exactly what they were trying to communicate at the point of need. Versus those who, like I taught the present perfect today, they didn't use it. It was a bad lesson, right?
Yeah. And what's funny though is like people, you can poke holes in that in some really productive ways. And like in a Romance language, for example, the example I always tell people is you use a reflexive verb first day of class. You don't tell anybody it's a reflexive verb, but you tell people, you get people to say, my name is Matt, which is a reflexive verb, and you do not care. They learn it as a chunk. Nobody does any analysis. If a student asks you, which they probably won't, but if they do, you deal with it outside of the moment of doing the communication. And you're not bothered by the fact that they don't have categorical grammar representation or explicit knowledge. You're very unbothered by it. When it's my name is, you're totally cool with it. But then we leave that moment for some reason and we start to go, but now they need to learn categories. And I often point out that disconnect, and that's a really powerful moment of reflection, I find, where people go, oh, if I did it then, what's stopping me from the chunk being the thing?
Yeah.
The Legos versus the puzzle pieces.
Marie Nelson, Leo, by the way. Marie wrote the book at the point.
I need to read that book. That sounds like a thing I would really enjoy.
It's a great book.
Marie Wilson Nelson. How simple then or complex, Matt, is that for an experienced teacher to make a I don't know if transition is the right word, but if have been teaching in this grammar-oriented, quote-unquote, fashion, and now I want to change, I think this is an obstacle, either real or just psychological, that a lot of teachers come up against. Even if I wanted to change, it sounds like a big move.
Yeah, it is.
How real is that? Or how simple is it to make that transition? Or what strategy would you recommend in that scenario?
That's such a good question. I think it is difficult and easy in different ways for novices versus experienced teachers. And I think there's, in the same way I believe about language learning, I don't think it's ever too late. I don't think time is the key variable. What I fundamentally believe is operating from a self-determination theory point of view. I think success is motivating. And that is the start of the virtuous cycle, is the success, not the motivation. So for a teacher, I think it starts with redefining what success looks like for you and for your students. Better if it's negotiated, right? Better if it's a conversation with students. Facilitated by you because you're an expert and they're not. And that's real. If you redefine success as like successfully able to do something with language in your class or outside of your class, you'll see it happen really quickly. And then when every day, what I try to do, I tell teachers all the time, it's like I used to work with 4-year-olds, right? I taught in an immersion school for a while with 4-year-olds. If you give 4-year-olds a piece of candy, guess what? They're going to see you the next day and ask you for some candy. So if you make every day salient to students a sort of, you're going to be able to do this thing well or better than you could do it when you walked in here, that is really exciting. And then it's exciting for both of you, right? That they can do it and they're excited. You're excited because they're excited. You're excited because you did it. You facilitated that thing happening. And that becomes really motivating really quickly. And then that gets compounded, of course, when people tell you, I did it outside of the classroom. This made a meaningful impact in my life outside of here. But I very much agree with, I know Claudia Fernandez talked about this. I know Build and Pattern certainly takes this stance. Again, the here and now, there and then, I think we should not treat the classroom like it's a space for practice and the real world as if it's somehow different from the classroom. The classroom is people's real world. So like we can do real communication. You can find something out about someone that you didn't know or decide who would make the best roommate among the people in this room. And that be the thing I direct your attention to. Hey, see how we tried to do the thing and you did it? And that emotional experience for students and teachers, I think, is really motivating. And sometimes I think the rub for experienced teachers sometimes is you felt successful the other way you were doing it. I certainly did. The first year I taught Spanish, I taught people explicit grammar rules, and they learned them well. On the test that I was using, they experienced high levels of success and were excited about Spanish. Until I started trying to talk to them in Spanish and was like, why can none of you speak any Spanish? And then suddenly none of us are happy anymore. And I'm like, what's going on here? And I said it to a mentor of mine and she was like, is that how you learn Spanish? By somebody telling you a bunch of rules? And I was like, no. And she was like, then why do you expect that they're going to learn it that way? And she was like, and do you see how you set them up for like long-term frustration? You set them up for short-term success, but you set them up for long-term frustration. And what you now are going to have students, my friend was telling me this happens to her regularly. She has a kid in her program who's been learning Chinese for 3 years. And then parents take them on a trip to China or Taiwan or whatever. And parent is waiting for kid to do something impressive. And kids, I don't know how to speak any Chinese. And then the parent is like, what have you been doing for years? So I think for experienced teachers, it has to be a redefinition of success first, because if high level accuracy was your benchmark for your professional efficacy, then until you decide on something else as a measure for your success and satisfaction, which matters for your well-being and sense of purpose, then you're going to feel like a failure to yourself if accuracy is the benchmark, because students' language is going to get really messy really quickly. And instead of looking at that as fun, exciting, emergent evidence of interlanguage development, I'll come back to your point about SLA, you look at it as, I'm not doing my job. I'm bad at my job. And especially if students are socialized to expect high accuracy and controlled performance, then they're going to think you're bad at your job too. And then they're going to shut your language program down because you're bad at it. So it is redefinition before I think the transition, before experimentation is going to ever become sustained implementation.
I want to talk about design because we had this conversation with Claudia, who designed an entire TBLT course for beginners in Spanish. And I wanted to get your take on designing a course around, and we know this is actually, I would say it's quite challenging to design around real communicative demands. So how did you go through the process of designing this course, Matt? How did you identify the target tasks? What shaped the syllabus? Can you tell us more? Can you walk us through that?
Such a good question. I was trained by Mike Long, right? My socialization into TBLT was very much in the Mike Long tradition of people have definable needs, and therefore you need to know what those are and tailor the suit to the person, so to speak. And Mike readily admitted in person and in print, that is most functional when the needs are homogeneous and stable over time. And Mike often worked in contexts where that was true. And one of the places we were talking before we started that I think Mike Long and Rod Ellis just wrote past each other for decades is that they just worked in different contexts. And in Rod's context, the context Rod is intimately familiar with, the needs are not stable or homogeneous in ways that in the Foreign Service Institute of the United States government, for diplomats and diplomacy workers, the needs are stable and definable across languages, more or less. I was socialized into needs analysis. And I've really come to redefine my own position there, where what's the fundamental logic of needs analysis? It's relevance. Is this a thing that you need to do? Maybe. But in some parts of the United States, do you need to speak Korean? Probably not. So is need the only potential definer of relevance? I don't think so. I think if it's a need, cool. If it's interesting, that's better than uninteresting. And if it's a thing you have a realistic opportunity to do in your life, versus it's a thing that, like, in some imagined convoluted reality could do. I think those 3 levers are the levers that I'm interested in pulling in identifying tasks and then going, is it this one or is it that one? How much time do I have? How many tasks are realistic? But that's what it has come down to for me. And Kalia and I are actually going to collaborate and try to do a needs analysis in her context and see over time if the needs are homogeneous and stable. Some have emerged, but there's some beautiful needs that have come out of some people's work, like Melissa Baralt and her colleagues at Florida International and in a couple other places with the MyBridge curriculum that when they did a needs analysis, which will be published pretty soon, the biggest need that they found that students learning Spanish in Miami wanted to fulfill was to help people in their daily life, to be able to, like, provide a little bit of Spanish to help someone find something, or to work in their fast food or Starbucks job, to be a connection between the person and their goal that perhaps without the Spanish bridge they couldn't do. And I thought, what a beautiful need. I've never seen that need before. But in fact, you could design a whole program around literally just that in your community. Now, so like my current Chinese class, I'm teaching an intermediate Chinese class right now, and the target tasks that I designed were, and this kind of relates to your question too, Andrew, and to the interview and the plenary that Jonathan Newton did. There's an assigned textbook, and that's been my reality in a couple of Chinese programs, in all of the Chinese programs I've ever worked in. In one of them that I worked in, the person who wrote the textbook was my literal boss. So there was no world in which I was not going to use that textbook at some level. But I was able to, what Jonathan has written about in quite a few places, to taskify the book. And what that looked like for me with college students is to just start with, I knew sort of like the lexical domains we were going to have to cover. And in my current context, that's weather, that's physical health, like symptoms, that's healthy lifestyle, and it's travel. Which, like,
so you have basically topics.
Exactly.
Topics, so not
and
needs,
the textbook is lexicogrammar based. Okay. So what that lets me do is go, both as a multilingual person myself and as a language educator with my students, it lets me go, when do we, like, in the 4 skills or the interpretive, presentational, interpersonal, the way ACTFL thinks about it, which I find very helpful, when do we talk about the weather? When do we consume in the target language weather-related content, right? How often do we check the weather app on our phone or watch the news with the weather on it in the target language? Never have I ever, in any language that is not English, in my entire life. And I have lived in other countries, and I never went and looked at the weather in Chinese because I could just do it in English, because that's the technological affordance of the current moment. But we talk about the weather when we're making plans, especially when we're making contingency plans. When we say, hey, let's do this weekend, but if it rains, what are we going to do? Are we going to still do it? Are we going to take stuff? Are we going to plan an alternative? So what the target task that my students ended up doing was write an email to an international student who was going to come visit Tuscaloosa for a campus visit, right? To come check out if they wanted to come to school here. And sort of the constraints on the task are like, this person only has one shot. They're coming once. So if the weather is awful that weekend, they still want to get the most out of the visit. So here's 3 real people. These are real humans that actually exist. Here's where they're from in the Chinese-speaking world, and here's a little bit of information about their hometown, because we also talked about, for your audience, making information relevant that's, oh, you're from a place that also has really hot, humid summers, then maybe you wouldn't hate the summer here, so maybe coming in the summer is not a bad idea. But you're from a place that, like, never gets above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you would be miserable here in July, so maybe don't come during that time. Or maybe come in July and see if you can take it. That became, and these are real humans that I, just friends of mine, people that exist. They're not coming to Tuscaloosa, right? So that is not true. It is not that they actually were talking to these people who do actually need this information to make a decision, but it's a plausible gap, if you will. Those people do not know anything about Tuscaloosa. They're just not actually going to come here. And the students had to write them an email, give them the best time to come, tell them what they could do, and make some contingency plans for them based on what they know about local weather. Oh, you're coming in March? Tornado season. So what do you need to know in case there's a tornado the weekend that you come here? So all of what we do is driven by that. And it helped me parse what linguistic resources are task essential. And they had access to the vocabulary list in the book. Never once did I test them on it. And I look at it at the end and I'm like, wow, you learned basically all of this stuff. And the stuff you didn't learn, you didn't
But
need.
incidentally, mostly.
Correct. Yeah,
right?
100%.
Yeah.
There was no intentional vocabulary learning at all. We talked about the weather. Every day we talked about either what did you do last weekend or, hey, we had a snowstorm. It happened to be we were going to have an unpredictable weather situation. This is Thursday. The weather's going to hit on Friday. And I was supposed to travel that following Monday. So like we spent the first 20 minutes of class going, what are you going to do this weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday? What if it rains? What if it snows? What if there's ice on the roads? What if you lose power? What if there's no class on Monday? Should we still have homework? And we did all of that in response to what actually was happening in our lives. But that was the pedagogic task leading to the task.
Yeah.
That was making contingency plans about weather. And I asked my students at the beginning and end of the unit, like, when do you talk about the weather in English with people? When do you read about the weather? When do you imagine that you might do this and do anything related to weather in Chinese? And basically what we had come up with as a group was it's either small talk. It's either you go, it's so cold today. And the person goes, yep. But that's not meaningful, sustained interaction. So I was like, let's not do that. So the alternative was making plans.
Because it reminds me,
relevant.
It's so good. This is so good. I want to go back to one thing you said, but it's
Sure.
so good because I remember observing a lesson a long time ago. It was a lesson on the weather. And the teacher was just asking the students to answer the question, what's the weather like today? And I was asking, I remember writing the comment to the teacher later and saying, are you training your students to actually become like
Weather people.
forecasters? Are they going to work as weather people? Because that's the only context I can imagine someone saying today is going to be rainy.
Right.
I'm like, I don't think anyone talks to his, hey, Andrew, today is going to be rainy and it's going to be a high of 17 and a low of 12.
Yeah, I can look out the window. I can see that. Yeah.
And there's some like things you can do, right? So like, here's an example of like how I created a plausible info gap that like lets students at least suspend the disbelief enough, right? My phone was dead one of the days. Literally, my phone had just died before I went to class. I forgot to charge it the night before. So I asked them, tell me what the weather's going to be like for the rest of the day. Look at your phones. Look at it in English because it's in English on your phone. I don't expect you to put the weather app into Chinese on your phone, but I can't see the weather app on my phone. So
Yeah.
tell me stuff, right? And then that gives me reasons to ask for, what's the temperature going to be? What, is it going to rain? Well, how likely is that? And it's not a, hey, Andrew, what color is my shirt? You and I can both see that. So why would we need to answer that question?
I had never really thought about that, but we always joke Canadians love to talk about the weather. We do, because it changes so consistently. We're in the season now, like morning, afternoon, night. You bring your suitcase when you go anywhere because it's different all the time, right? But plans, oh my God, big snowstorm coming in the next 3 days. What do we do if this? Are we having class on campus? Are we doing online? What should we do? Do I have to shovel? Even just personal plans, like we were supposed to go for dinner on Friday night. Are we still going to do that? Because
Exactly.
it's that is the scenario where we always talk about the weather. If I'm have plans to stay home, I'm not talking about it because it doesn't affect me. But as soon as it affects me, yes, now I'm talking about it.
Which brings me back to the question, to the comment you've made earlier about needs analysis. When needs are stable and homogeneous, it's easy to design a task syllabus. But when needs are not stable and homogeneous, because I know this is going to be a question people are probably going to ask.
Sure.
What do we do? Should we focus on topics? What is your suggestion there, Matt?
I
What
think there's
should
a couple
teachers do?
possibilities. And I really wrestled with this. It's funny, I have a couple of like voice notes to myself and a long conversation that I had with a colleague over winter break as I was prepping this class. And I really wrestled as a scholar practitioner, as a person who believes in needs analysis generally, as in if you can do it, it definitely is worth doing. It's easier to do as a team, and I have lots of feelings about that too. But I really wrestled with the reality that practitioners know, which is why we react so negatively to the idea of needs analysis so often, especially when they're unstable and they change every semester, is I get my list of students really close to when the semester starts. So there is no world in which I by myself, or even a team of my research team, could go in and engage deeply with the students, the domains they plan to work or language in, and do a robust needs analysis in the very short amount of time before class starts. So what it looks like to me, what the sort of compromises that I've made for myself that I feel pretty good about are like, either if you have some type of textbook, whatever, and you can taskify it, and that is the coherence of the program for now, which is negotiable in the future, maybe. Like, that's not a bad springboard, to steal Jonathan Newton's word. It's a place to start. And then you can define or throw out a couple ideas of here's 3 potential target tasks in this topic area that are likely relevant to this particular type of student, right? College students using intermediate level language who are or are not likely to study abroad. And you can throw out a couple possibilities. What I ended up doing this semester is I just gave them 3 choices and said, hey, here's 3 that I came up with. I would be comfortable with us doing any of these 3 for this first unit. Pick one. Vote. Democracy. And like, they're all like, what I know is they're all close enough that they weren't going to cause me a bunch of headache if they went in direction A, B, or C. And what it lets me do at the end of the unit, and then I'll do again at the end of the semester, is looking back, how'd you feel about those? Was that like the most relevant thing, the most interesting thing? Do you think that's a thing you're ever actually going to do? If yes, cool. We might stick with that again, might iterate on it a little bit. If not, throw me some alternatives. So it's almost a post hoc needs analysis, right? It's a forced choice model, and then it's a let's follow up and think about, was this actually relevant and meaningful? It's the same thing I did in my dissertation. I had no influence on the tasks that they chose, but I did analyze whether or not they thought the tasks were interesting, meaningful, whether they had ever tried to do that thing in Spanish outside the context of the classroom. And that, I think, gives us a lot of information to make decisions about pruning, changing, updating, without what I think is an unrealistic burden on individual teachers or programs in the possibility of non-homogeneous needs, which is to like reinvent the wheel every year. Nobody's going to do that. And I think the harder we make TBLT, the less attractive we make it.
Exactly.
So what are we doing?
Right.
That's another point that Jonathan also reinforced in our conversation with him, is we don't really have to try to reinvent the wheel with task-based language teaching, because it already is a bit of a, I wouldn't say a mountain, but it's a bit of an obstacle to a lot of teachers who already feel like task-based language teaching is complicated, is difficult, it's not easy to implement. There are a lot of hesitation towards adopting task-based language teaching. I think hopefully the conversations that we're having with all of these experts here on the show would help us demystify this idea that tasks have to be, because again, even, and you remember this, Jonathan said this in an interview, which I loved, and it doesn't have to be Mike Long's TBLT. It doesn't have to be Rod Ellis' TBLT. It could be Leo's TBLT. It could be Andrew's TBLT. It could be Matt's TBLT.
Even with Matt, you said earlier, a few minutes ago that you do stand firm. Needs analysis has been traditionally a fundamental component of a task-based approach. But I'm wondering, has there been any shift in that, or do you think there's a shift? The reason for the question is Leo and I spoke with Evan Frendo on a show a few months ago, or at least when this is released, it will have been released. His context for transparency is completely different. He's not in a university. He's a corporate trainer in Germany. But I remember him saying, you probably remember this, that he says he doesn't even do needs analysis anymore because the learners or his students do it for him. Like with technology that exists, it's very easy, in his opinion, for students to just do their own needs analysis, to understand their own goals and motivations. Again, he works with people who are at work and he helps them perform their job better in English. Where do you fall on the role of a needs analysis in the AI age, in the technology age? Has it shifted, or is it still the same as it has been before?
It's a really good question. I think it depends on context, in the same way that like we like to make simple causal claims, right? We like to say yeast causes bread to rise, but change the temperature and the bread acts different, right? Context matters a lot. There are places in which the needs are defined really simply, like kids whose dominant language is not the dominant language of society who are going to school. The communicative needs that they have are the school stuff that they need to be able to do. They need to be able to do a science experiment and write a book report and whatever. And I don't know that you need to like go above and beyond to do a needs analysis there. There are contexts in which the needs analysis can be done once and then you double check it a couple times, 10 years out. I think we should do way more needs met analysis, and nobody does that. Actually, a colleague of mine just is going to publish, it's under review. I know she's going to talk about it at AAL this year, the American Association of Applied Linguistics. She did look at a student who went through a TBLT course and tracked her for a couple of years afterwards to see if the needs analysis met her needs in a professional EFL context, which was amazing. I can't wait to read it. There are some contexts where I think a needs analysis, you do it once, and because of homogeneity, as long as you check in on it a couple of times, because people change, right? That's why teaching is so fun, because the people are never the same. And there are other contexts where I think a needs analysis light is probably all that you're ever going to do. But for me, it always comes down to the goal. The fundamental logic of a needs analysis is maximizing relevance. And that's it. So if you can do that, you do it in the minimally viable product way. If the way is like, I would just advise a local, I don't know anything about, right? English, again, is not my domain, but there's a local community-based English program here in Tuscaloosa that just reached out to me, and we've been chatting. And I told them, literally just ask the people who come in, what is something you tried to do in English this week or wanted to do in English this week that you couldn't quite do? That's a needs analysis. It doesn't have to be this giant research team, all of these instruments. And there's some people who know way more about this, who are doing lots of brilliant work thinking about this. Jorge Gilabert and Alexander Magnitsky in Spain, Ellen Serafini at George Mason, both are thinking in parallel and together too about, like, you said mountain earlier, Leo, and there's a paper that I wrote somewhere in the world that talked about mountain TBLT, and like, we're making it an insurmountable mountain, and that's not useful. And they're doing some really fantastic thinking, I think, right now about making a needs analysis a more realistic thing that people can do, and where the principled compromises between what is ideally robust as a research study and what is practically meaningful and viable. And I think that exact question is what we need to be doing if TBLT is ever going to be a viable project anywhere. It's documentation first. It's just, what are people doing? To your point a second ago that Jono said, what does Leo's TBLT look like? What does Andrew's TBLT look like? What does Matt's TBLT look like? What choices are we making that are intentional and unintentional deviations from, quote unquote, the ideal, somebody's ideal? And what are the consequences of those choices for good and for perhaps sacrifice of something? I don't think that the choices are good or bad. I think they just have consequences. And so if you say, I'm not going to do a needs analysis, a pro of that is that saves you a bunch of time to do other stuff. And a potential consequence is that you chose tasks that students are going to be like, I'm never going to do this. Why do we have to learn this in Spanish? Claudia and I have talked, for example, in her program, one of the things they had to do is, one of the tasks is write a movie review, write a synopsis and a review of a movie, lowest rated task in terms of relevance. But students also rated it quite interesting. Another pattern that came out of the data that I generated working with Claudia's amazing program is that there was a really clear pattern of the highest rated relevance tasks were all speaking related, and the lowest rated ones were all related to writing somehow. And so that's an interesting thing that opens up lots of questions and doors just by asking people, how relevant to your life is this? How interesting is it to you? Have you ever done it outside of class? And it creates an interesting tension where after the basic language program, the expectations of writing and accuracy increase a lot really quickly. So again, there's a tension, right? That's like, it might feel relevant to the students, but are then we creating a later discouragement that's like they get to someone else's class and program that's not task-based, who are like, why can't these students write anything? So it's a complex ecology, but it's choices. And I think it's documentation. It's why I don't actually call my dissertation an evaluation ever. I don't have the authority to evaluate anybody. I'm trying to document and understand the choices, because there's a difference between chaotic deviation and principled compromise.
Exactly. And I think that's the whole point, I think, with task-based language teaching is that and I think Jeff Jordan is going to complain when I say this, and he's probably going to reply to this message eventually when he listens to this podcast. But
I look forward to it.
I feel like that's the point in the argument where I try to move away from is I don't want to be too dogmatic about we have to follow Mike Long's TBLT sequence, or we have to follow Rod Ellis's TBLT sequence. I think what we really want is we want a little bit of that principled eclecticism. We want practitioners to bring their own experience, to bring their own context to task-based language teaching based on their, as you said, based on their context, based on the needs of the students that they have, the learners that they have. So we can see these different types of task-based language teaching environments or frameworks or approaches emerge, and we can actually have, I don't think we're going to have a homogeneous picture here, but we will have people teaching languages in a way that is more aligned with how we actually learn them, which I think is the essence of task-based language teaching, in my opinion.
Right.
But I wanted to ask you one question before we get to the final part, because
Sure.
believe it or not, we have been talking for a long time here, Matt. Thank you for this. I can't believe it's been.
It's great. I feel like I could talk about this stuff all day. So
we're going to have to have you back on the show for sure.
looking forward to it.
But one of the questions that I know I'm going to get, and this is one that I get often when I post about task-based language teaching, and I get comments, not just always in the LinkedIn comments, but I get messages, some not very nice messages sometimes, and I have to block people, because if you're not going to be able to engage with me in a cordial way, I'm not going to do the same to you. So
No.
When working with task-based language teaching, Matt, where do you feel the strongest pull, like the strongest pull back towards a grammar sequence? Because a lot of teachers would say, but Leo, what do you do when the task demands language that the students don't yet have? So I wanted to throw that to you.
My favorite metaphor there is, what do you do when you want to buy something expensive and you don't have enough money? You save money. You can't spend money you don't have. So if you're not giving people enough input to develop and time, that's the other key variable there, then what do you think is going to happen? They're not going to do it, or you're going to get there's some really brilliant work by people who don't do anything with language learning. You're going to get performance, not learning. I'm thinking about people like Paul Kirshner and Dylan William in education, who talk about, if learning is a durable change in long-term memory, then sure, you can get them to pretend to show you that they know how to do the complex grammar thing that you just practiced in isolation. But transfer appropriate processing will tell us that if the mental processes at work during the learning are different from the processes that will be demanded in the use, the likelihood of transfer is diminished. So like, for me, the logic is always create the demands in the classroom that are as close to the demands of the thing outside of the classroom, because we're doing real communication in the classroom too. And again, I think the pull comes in two directions. The pull is internal sometimes for teachers, where again, you've been socialized into accuracy, and you don't want your students to be perceived as idiots. You don't want you to be perceived by your colleagues as an inept teacher. And accuracy is a low-hanging fruit heuristic for learning. It's a proxy for learning,
it really is.
Whether it's good or not. But you also get it from students. You'll get students who ask you questions. They ask metalinguistic questions. They ask you why. And what I have found to be a very productive thing in my own practice, and I've found this to be helpful in conversations with colleagues, is you have to hear the question behind the question. The same way that sometimes students in a language other than English class, especially little kids, they'll tell you, speak English. They're not actually asking you to speak English. They're asking you to be comprehensible. They're asking you to stop stressing them out because they don't understand you and they want to understand you. And to them, as a lay person who is not an expert language educator, the most obvious way is, you speak English, I speak English, let's just do this in English, because then we can all be comfortable. But if you show them that they can understand you a different way, they will still arrive at the comfort and probably will be happier about it over time, that like they stuck with the language. So you have to hear the question behind the question. A student says, how does this grammar work? A student says, why is this way? Two things are true. One, for a strong percentage of those students, they don't actually care. They were curious for a second. And if you tell them, come ask me later, send me an email, I will talk meta language with you until the cows come home, but not right now, because I'm not going to interrupt what everybody else is in here to do. 90% of the people will never come because they don't actually care that much. They were curious in the moment. They formed some type of hypothesis or question, which the older they get, the more explicit knowledge of language they have, the more likely they are to do anyway. It's not a bad thing. They're engaged. They're thinking about language learning, which is what they're here to do. But you can redirect and see if they come. If they come, talk to them about it, share resources. It's totally doable. Or it's that they have a way more specific thing that they want than what they asked you. They'll tell you, how do you form the past tense in Spanish? But if you ask them, what do you want to say? What do you want to do? They'll tell you something very specific. They'll tell you, I just want to say I went to the store. And you go, oh, cool, here's your word. Here's your chunk, right? So the question behind the question is usually much less of a complex, thorough, metalinguistic, categorical description than we read it as being. But we want to do a good job. We want our students to perceive us as competent. We want to feel competent. So we launch into this long description of irregular verbs and all these other things because we're trying to do a good job. It is well-intentioned. I just always also come back to the simple math of I have such limited time with my students. I have 37 and a half hours over 15 weeks. That is a day and a half. And I tell my students, if you learn anything out of this class in a day and a half, pretty good. Because in your first language, you had 18,000 hours before age 2 of life. And if we take out a third of that while you were sleeping, you still had 12,000 hours, which is not what we have. So let's be realistic about the expectations. And that's why I'm going to spend my time this way, not that way, because it's limited. If we had all the time in the world, sure, let's dig into the meta language if you care about that. We just don't. So
it's almost like strategy management, right? Leo's favorite joke, but also not a joke about or argument against pre-teaching vocabulary is because like when you go to the bank, they don't give you a list of words that they're going to ask you before you go to the teller and ask a question. Right?
Correct. Laurencia Henshaw always says the metaphor she uses, which I love, is you don't think about the alphabet and go, I have some keys on my keyboard. What words can I type with the letter J? You go, what words do I need to say? What do I need to do? And which letters do I need to do that thing? Like, I was at a TBLT conference one year and my keyboard broke, the letter E broke, and I was very sensitive to the lack of the letter E because I needed it all the time. But the letter Z also was broken and I didn't use it one single time for the entire week that I was out of the country. Right? So what do you need? And that's also an anchor point for teachers, I think that's helpful. Mike would say you need samples of target discourse and you need to analyze it for the features. And teachers, we give unrealistic, biased perceptions of what you need to do a task. True, but like it's a simple anchor point to have a teacher, hey, just do the thing. You want a student to be able to write an email to an international student to invite them here? Do it yourself. Write one right now and see what happens. If you have a couple extra minutes, ask 3 other people to write it. Native speaker or not, doesn't matter. Expert speaker is good enough for me. And look what's in common. And that is your task essential language. You don't pre-teach it, but like that gives you, if you need language as some type of anchor of what are prototypical features, what are helpful common ways to say this thing, there's something, as opposed to you just decided that they need this categorical grammar knowledge. If you need language as an anchor, I think task essentialness is a helpful anchor, as long as we don't think about it categorically.
Yeah. Andrew, we're wrapping up here. Do you have any final questions you want to ask?
I could go forever, but no, I think that reminds me, Leo, years ago, you're creating a lesson for your students. I forget exactly what it was, but you asked me and a few other people to record our voices.
Yeah.
Remember this?
Yes, giving recommendations. Yeah, I was like, just give me some recommendations. You're like a newcomer to Canada. Someone is coming to visit for the weekend. I was like, just talk about it. Just record yourself talking about it.
Exactly.
And we did. And I remember specific, because sometimes I use this, where all 3 of us used the verb, you should check out blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And that was never in any materials. It was never and students never knew it. But all of us used, you should check out this. You should check out this. Yeah.
Exactly. And like,
there is, Yeah.
It's like the Starbucks study. Have you guys ever read in the Mike Long's needs analysis book from 2005? The least frequent word at a Starbucks is coffee. You don't say coffee at Starbucks unless you're asking for iced coffee. But like we teach people to do that. You don't ask for a hamburger at McDonald's. You ask for anything but a hamburger, right? You never actually say the lexical item hamburger. So record yourself ordering at McDonald's and you're going to get a much more accurate picture of what is expected. And it's helpful. I don't know. And it's fascinating, right? Because you stumble upon these things that are like, actually, that are useful. And again, it comes back to success.
Use languages, yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, it can be
based on that
fun.
I like to think about it as this is actually based on the here and now of how people use language as opposed to the there and then of textbooks.
Yeah, exactly.
2 questions I have for you. The first one is, what is because you've mentioned you studied with Mike Long. He was your prof. What is your fondest memory of him?
Of Mike? Oh. So many. Mike, in so many ways, Mike shaped my trajectory. You know what it is? I know exactly what it is. I'm getting emotional because it's in my dissertation dedication. I saw something that I didn't see really early in my career. So I took 3 classes with Mike. I was in his office all the time. I went and did a master's in SLA 100% convinced that I have no interest in research, that I needed an advanced degree to be able to teach language at the university level. Second language acquisition was what I really enjoyed in my linguistics, mostly structural linguistics undergraduate degree. So I went and did a master's in SLA. I also wanted to live in the DC area for personal reasons at the time. So I stumbled upon Mike. I didn't go to Maryland like wanting to work with him or any of them. I had no idea who Mike Ross, Kira Gore, Nanjiang, Robert DeKaiser, or Steve Ross were. I just no clue. So that was like the luckiest find of my life. But Mike said about me, Mike wrote a letter of recommendation for me the week that he died for our PhD programs. Oh. Because I went back to Mike years after I left my master's. He was like, "You're applying for PhD programs." No, absolutely not. I don't want to be you. I used to see Mike sitting in his office, typing with his 2 fingers, angry, probably typing something that Ron Ellis was going to read, right? And I was like, man, I don't want to be you. He had stacks of SSLA books as tall as, or journals as tall as him in his office. And I was like, I don't know if I want this life. And I decided years later that I wanted to do a PhD, and Mike made recommendations. He actually edited the crap out of that medical Spanish paper twice, and I still have that edited version from him that tells me that I use too many M dashes and don't know how to use a comma, and probably true. But Mike said about me in this letter of recommendation, he actually sent it to me because he was going to the hospital, and this is the last time I ever talked to him. He said something about me being like, he said something about I would be a really good fundamental researcher. I would be really good at basic research, at theory-driven research that has nothing to do with practice, but that I'm adamantly committed to not doing that and to doing work as a practitioner and a researcher. And I was like, wow, you saw that so much earlier than I did. Like, you're so right. And like, you saw that in 2017, and I was like 100% not interested in being a researcher at all. Then here I am. So I don't know what exactly he saw. It's probably because I bugged the crap out of him all the time and was like, who cares about this theoretical stuff? Like, why is this useful to me? And that's my fault, because I didn't go get a degree in instructed SLA. I went and got a degree in SLA. It was a theory-driven empirical studies published in language learning SSLA, the SLR degree. It wasn't for teachers. And I really wrestled with that for 2 years. But he got it a long time before I did. And he always did that himself. I think Mike, to his last years, himself in a community English program, local in Maryland. Like, he did a needs analysis there and was committed to being an educator himself in addition to being a researcher. And that, I think that matters if we're going to do this well.
And my last question is a question that I like asking of people, and I'm going to ask you. It's a there and then question.
Cool.
It's a task.
Love it.
If you could have a gigantic billboard anywhere with anything on it, metaphorically speaking, just getting a message out to millions, billions of people, what would it say and why? Could be a few words, could be a paragraph. It's up to you.
I like that question a lot. I think this billboard would have to be in the context of the United States, because everywhere else in the world already knows this. But I think it would say, multilingualism is the norm for humanity. Your brain has everything it needs to be multilingual, and you have no idea how any level of language learning might change your life. I think that's what I would want people in this country, people especially who grow up monolingual, because there's certainly many people who don't in this country too. But I think I would be interested in the reminder that, like, we are the minority, people in the US who grow up as monolingual English speakers of one variety of English, who are not even navigating multiple varieties of English, which many people also do in this country, that we're the global minority by a huge proportion. So decenter the norm of monolingualism. And then the trying it is all upside. I truly do not believe that any amount of time spent learning a language comes with any demonstrable downside. The cost is time, for sure, energy, which we have limited, money sometimes. But I think it's all upside. I think whether it makes you wrestle with a challenge or humbles you, or it gives you an opportunity to communicate with somebody else, or it reminds you that people experience the world differently than you do, whether you achieve language proficiency, you fall in love, you get a job, whatever, the whole gambit from you tried it and stopped. I think you still are different because you did that, even if you don't know it and couldn't articulate it to somebody. But I think it's all upside. So I wish in this country we did it more and we invested in it and talked about it societally in that way, as opposed to this all or nothing. Either you're fluent in a language and employed to do something with it, or it's not worth your time. I think that's what I would want people to know.
That's a good answer.
Very good answer. I wish we
wrap
did it
that up
more
there.
in Canada as well, because it's
I believe that.
officially English and French, a bilingual country, but in terms of the actual people, it's very few who speak both. Many people speak many other languages here, of course, especially in the big cities, very multilingual, but French is, we have one bilingual province. It's not Quebec, it's
Right.
not Ontario, it's New Brunswick. I wish, that's a good sentiment for Canada too, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you guys. This was such a pleasure.